So now it's time to introduce Kevin more formally. So Kevin, thanks again for joining us. For any of you that don't know, Kevin is a professor of governance and development in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. He's been actively involved as a researcher and a campaigner for good food policies in the UK and beyond for many, many years. His current research includes a project on school food reform in the UK that's funded by the UKRI Health Inequalities in the Food Systems. And the project is about transforming, and he's also involved in another project about transformation of public food systems in Sweden, which is led by Lund University. Kevin is also a member of School Meals Coalition, the aim of which is to ensure that every child in the world has access to a healthy and nutritious meal at school by 2030. That's quite a mission, and we look forward to hearing much more about food and serving food that is healthy, sustainable, more in schools, hospitals and prisons over the next 30 minutes. I'm going to hand over to you, Kevin, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay, many thanks, Christina. It's a real pleasure to contribute to this seminar series, not least because it gives me an opportunity to acknowledge the role that the Centre has played in establishing the discipline of food policy studies in the United Kingdom, and the way that the original architects of the school, Tim Lang, Martin Caraher, David Barling, have played in promoting this discipline. And speaking personally, I've always found them incredibly generous in sharing their own knowledge about food policy studies, and they've helped me a lot personally. Most recently, Tim reviewed my book proposal for the publisher, and Martin was kind enough to comment on my school meals chapter. So I owe them a great deal. So having paid my dues, as it were, to the centre, let me begin by saying I'd like to try to do two things in the next 25 minutes. First of all, to very, very briefly run through the key themes and arguments of the book. And then secondly, to examine the emerging landscape of food policy in the UK to see if the arguments stack up. And then I'll end by raising some questions that need to be addressed by what I call the good food movement in and beyond the United Kingdom. So hopefully, if these slides will work, and they seem to be. In terms of the origins of the book, I guess they really stretch back more than 20 years of research on public food systems in and beyond the UK, and it began really as a labour of love. That is an unfunded project on the Powys Food Links project, which aimed to get local food into a local hospital, and in that specific aim, it was a total failure. But as we all know, failure can be instructive if we care to take the time and trouble to learn the lessons of that. And that's what I try to do with colleagues, both in the university with Adrian Morley and in association with the Soil Association and Sustain, two NGOs who will feature prominently in my talk and who feature prominently in my book, as a matter of fact. So the reasons for the failure of this project are worth addressing and remembering, because they still loom large today, I argue in the book. Perceived European regulations on procurement. I say perceived because they turned out to be more apparent than real. And then tendering procedures that were too complex for local producers, catering preferences which favored large corporate suppliers to reduce the transaction costs. But the most shocking thing of all for me at this stage, over 20 years ago, was to find out, remembering at the time I was a food policy rookie, as it were, and I was genuinely shocked that NHS audit conventions were unable to account for the health gains of nutritious food. And still today, as I'll argue later, the NHS is struggling to factor in the health gains and to assess the real costs and benefits of a food system that's healthy, fairer, and sustainable. So, in terms of the book, the book is in three parts. Let me just very quickly run through the parts and the arguments. The opening part tries to set the scene really internationally by looking at what I call the agri-food polycrisis. That is to say, these interlinked crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and diet-related diseases. And I try to argue that reclaiming the public plate, that is to say, deploying public food procurement in a really strategic manner, can really help to fashion a fairer, healthier, and more sustainable food system by substituting what I call a values-based procurement system in place of a neoliberal approach, which has dominated the scene for the past 40 years. And that neoliberal approach really has allowed low cost, I argue, to masquerade as best value. So those are the broad arguments of part one. And then in part two, I try to sacrifice breadth for depth by having a deep dive into three public food systems: schools, healthcare, and prisons. And in schools, I tried to address three themes really. First of all, the whole school approach, by which I mean the attempt to align the pedagogy of the classroom with the provenance of the food in the dining room. A challenge which is easier said than done, of course. And then I tried to document two what I call meta trends. These trends are running through the school food reform movement internationally. The first is a social trend. The second is an ecological trend. The social trend is the trend to universality. The movement to slow but sure, the movement to universal free school meals. And I try to chart that in the UK and elsewhere. And the ecological trend is the shift to plant-based menus, which is an enormous challenge. And I try to document that in and beyond the United Kingdom. I'll come back to these challenges in a moment. In terms of healthcare and prisons, which I don't have so much time to address today, sadly, but I'll mention them. In the healthcare chapter, the argument is very simple. And I'm arguing that hospitals in fast food nations like the United Kingdom and the US, hospitals are being set up to fail because they're being asked to provide a clinical solution to a societal problem. And I'll come back to that challenge in a moment. And then thirdly, in prisons, I examine the history of the carceral diet and its discontents. And I chart the history of that diet and the quest to establish nutritious food for prisoners, really who are in an absolutely wretched state in the United Kingdom, but especially in the US. And having set out the problems, I also then try to find some chinks of light, as it were, to look at those institutions, those prisons that are innovating socially by providing better food against the odds, against the system, rather than because of the system. And in the UK, I use the Clink charity as a vignette for trying to understand the potential of good food and how it offers hope and dignity to help prisoners to rehabilitate themselves. I'll come back to this later. And then in the final part, I try to look at the agents of change, and I talk about the good food movement, by which I mean really civil society organizations working in concert with governments and public bodies to create a fairer, healthier, and more sustainable food system. And I focus in particular on two organizations, Soil Association and Sustain, who I argue have really punched above their weight in the history of good food movement in the UK. They've helped in particular to change the way that public sector bodies view and value food by creating what I call foodscapes of hope, which I'll come back to in a moment, right away, in fact. Many of you on the call will recognize both the Soil Association and Sustain. In terms of the Good Food for All, this is about the attempt to design and deliver a whole school approach, a practical system called Food for Life. And I look at the challenges, the scope for it, as well as the barriers, and I outline the multiple benefits that can be achieved, the social, economic, ecological benefits that are associated with the Food for Life program. And I take my hat off to the Soil Association for pioneering this highly innovative program. On the right, some of you will recognize Sustain's project, what used to be called Good Food for Londoners, Good Food for All Londoners. And one of the innovative things, you'll recognize this from one of the reports, where in the case of free school meals, they try to identify leaders and laggards, in other words. And I argue in the book that this methodology, putting hitherto unknown information in the public domain, has had a really innovative effect in terms of raising awareness, galvanizing action, and then catalyzing change to try to create a race to the top. And this is a methodology that all food movements can use, it seems to me. I'll come back to the limits of this in a moment, because Sustain is now rolling it out in England, beginning in the Northeast region, which I'll come back to later. Some of you also will recognize this from this wonderful report by, I think it was the Food Foundation that produced it with its allies, called The Superpowers of Free School Meals. And what it shows really, it shows the balkanization of the United Kingdom across the 4 nations, where we are seeing 4 very different school food systems now. We in Scotland, Wales, and London, we are seeing a system which is pioneering universal primary free school meals. Sadly, in England, England is a laggard in this respect, and the Starmer government has decided not to follow suit, not to roll out a national program in England, because they argue they're introducing free breakfast schemes instead. Now, breakfast schemes are important, but they're not the nutritional equivalent of a hot midday meal. And that's why we need to campaign to encourage England to see a national scheme, as is happening in Scotland, Wales, and in the London boroughs at the moment. I'll come back to the challenges of school meals in a moment, but let me give an example, a good practice example that I use in the book to highlight the city of Malmö in southern Sweden, because I argue that Malmö is an international reference point for school food reform. It's based on what they call the SMART system, which is outlined here, and all these slides are available, by the way, so I can rush through some of these slides and people can check them out later if they want. It's based on the SMART system, and the aims of the policy were just twofold: to go organic and to reduce the carbon footprint of food served in the city. And the success factors which have been distilled here in terms of clear aims, leadership, engagement and training of staff, catering staff and procurement staff, and working closely with both students, parents, and suppliers. So as the Swedes say, there's no mystery. It's just hard work, dedicated work along these lines. Let me shift quickly to health, though I don't have a great deal of time to delve into it. I think these are 2 of the most important health reports that have come out in recent years with respect to food. On the left, there's the Shelley Review, chaired by Phil Shelley, which was unlike any hospital food review in living memory, it seems to me, because instead of working with celebrity chefs who may have understood food, but they knew nothing about hospitals, Phil Shelley put together a team of hospital experts. And at the heart of that report is an attempt to have a holistic food strategy that integrates procurement, catering, and nurses. Those three functions which have been woefully disconnected in the past. And that's what partly helps to explain the poor state of hospital food in the UK over the years. And Phil Shelley has done first class work in terms of now trying to disseminate these good practices, a point I'll come on to in a moment. And then we've got the famous House of Lords report, Recipe for Health, which many of you will know, and which calls for really radical action from government in terms of offering an integrated, comprehensive food strategy, as well as mandatory standards that are monitored and to ensure compliance across the food system. Too many recommendations to go into now, but I just want to highlight these two reports for shining a path, a pathway to collective action to transform the food system in our healthcare settings, because the challenge is clear. We all know poor old Sisyphus, condemned for eternity to a life of futile labor. And that's the image that comes to mind for me when we think that hospitals are being set up to fail, as I said earlier, by providing a clinical solution to a societal problem. The societal problem being, of course, the epidemic of diet-related diseases, many of them increasingly linked to the prevalence of ultra-processed foods, particularly in countries like the UK and the US. And that's why we need radical regulation from governments to reduce these foods and to create incentives for making healthy food both accessible and affordable. And hospitals, in this sense, are part of the problem. The challenge is to move, as I think they are moving in the public health hospitals in New York City, where they're moving to plant-based menus by default. This could deliver a triple dividend. It could deliver cheaper menus, it could deliver healthier menus, and more climate-friendly menus. And as organizations like Greener by Default argue, what's not to like about that? On the right, the World Resources Institute has highlighted the best practices in menu design for plant-rich diets, aligning plant-based menus with behavioral insights into how we can change behavior in terms of going into more plant-rich menus. These are the challenges for us in schools, in hospitals, and throughout the public sector and society generally. We can come back to this in a moment. And this is what Phil Shelley is now trying to do, identifying exemplar sites in the NHS to identify good practice and to spread good practice. And this is a challenge because oftentimes local good practice stops on site and it doesn't disseminate so that it becomes the norm rather than the exception at national level. We've seen exemplars before. 20 years ago, Cornwall NHS was an exemplar area for hospital food, but it petered out because locally the team retired or moved on, and nationally it wasn't incentivized to be spread and shared throughout the system. So a word of warning about exemplar sites. Oftentimes we find that good practice has proved to be a bad traveller, and we need to address that conundrum, it seems to me. Moving quickly to the carceral diet. It's hard to frame this prison food system because here we're dealing with some of the most difficult conditions in the entire system. In this chapter, what I've tried to do is compare the UK and the US, because these are the two mass incarceration systems in the advanced OECD world. we've seen mass incarceration and mass food production to service mass incarceration. And at the heart of these stories, I try to tell the story of two nutritional experiments in the UK, where nutritional supplementation was introduced to the most violent institution in England, where it led to an incredible reduction in violent behavior. But the mystery was that successive governments, never acted on the results. And I argue the reason being ultimately is because it was felt that prisoners simply didn't deserve it. And in the US, I address an even more extraordinary nutritional problem, the problem of what Americans call Nutriloaf. The Nutriloaf controversy is like something out of a Michel Foucault book in terms of discipline and punish, where a grotesque food concoction of unrelated foods, breads, fruits, pastas, are baked together in a meatloaf dish, which allegedly meets nutritional standards. And that's served to prisoners for misbehaving. In other words, food is served as a form of punishment. This is why it's been outlawed in certain states, and why many prisoners are now litigating to show that it's inhuman, quite frankly. These problems haven't gone away. HMP Park, the biggest prison in Wales, food has proved to be appalling. 17 prisoners died last year in Park in somewhat mysterious circumstances. So these problems are ongoing. And look at the scale of the problems. At least 10 serious medical conditions are associated with a mainstream carceral diet. And this is why this is a problem. Even if you don't care about prisoners from an ethical point of view, let's say the Daily Mail approach in the UK, then we should care about them from a fiscal point of view, because we have an enlightened self-interest in seeing prisoners emerge from prison who are well. Otherwise, if they're not well, they become a drain on the public purse. So if you don't care about the ethics, at least care about your own taxpayers' pounds, as it were, which is what I argue in the book. And then I focus on the Clink Charities work, which is extraordinary in terms of reducing the number of reoffenders who have gone through the Clink food program. And the secret of the Clink program is not just equipping prisoners with skill sets, but also helping them into employment after release and mentoring them, so that that prisoners have a network, have a support network, have somewhere decent to live, as well as having skill sets to earn gainful employment. So moving quickly then to my last phase, which is, well, what are the prospects for change more generally? I thought Henry Dimbleby summed it up really well in his national food plan, actually. And this is not a mystery, is it? We all know what the secrets are for a transition to a fairer, healthier, more sustainable systems. More fruit and veg and fiber on the one hand, and less meat on the other. Easy to say, very hard to do, because the challenge is, where do we start? We start, I argue, in schools, because this is where habits of a lifetime can be laid down if we've got the right culture, the right leadership, and the right political support. These are the two faces. These are the two faces of school food futures in England, it seems to me. On the one side, we see the London mayors in the independent evaluation of what Sadiq Khan has done in London. And I take my hat off to him and the boroughs for introducing universal primary free school meals, identifying the early wins from this programme. On the right is a tragic story, in my view. If you've had a chance to look at my book, on the very first page of the book, I'm extolling the policy and practice of Oldham in Greater Manchester, because Oldham, which has been called the poorest town in England, won the first ever gold award for a Food for Life food service, proving that a poor borough could design state-of-the-art school meals. But this is the report that's gone to Cabinet, basically saying that Oldham is shutting up shop. It's closing down its school catering service, following a whole bunch of other local authorities, Manchester, and many other, too many to mention. So many, in fact, that I fear that the local authority role in school catering in England is going the way of Meals on Wheels and going the way of adult social care, that it's diminishing to the point of insignificance if these trends extrapolate to the future. So it's a clarion call to defend the role of municipalities, of local authorities in the school food system. And this is the challenge for us in England, because in Scotland and Wales, of course, local authorities still play a very powerful role. And in Scotland and Wales, we've also created institutional frameworks in which foster rather than frustrate school food reform. Scotland's got its Good Food Nation Act. Wales has got its Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And just yesterday, or this week rather, Welsh Government launched a new community food strategy, which puts in place the local infrastructure to promote a fairer, healthier system. What's happening in Europe? This is the biggest school food reform program anywhere in the European Union. It's the School Food for Change program run by ICLEI and its partners, where in red we see the project cities, and in orange we see the replication partner cities to spread good practice. This is the way to address the conundrum that I mentioned earlier. What do we do about scaling local good practice so that good practice becomes the norm rather than the exception? This is a new map about the school meal system in Europe. In pink, we can see the universal free school meal countries: Finland, Sweden, Estonia, and right in the middle there, you see little Luxembourg, a recent addition. And then further on down, you see Croatia. And there's in red, the solitary case of the only country in the European Union that has no school meal program whatsoever. Poor old Bulgaria, who we need to encourage to join the bandwagon, as it were. Internationally, we have the School Meals Coalition. In the UK, it's led by Don Bundy and his colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which inaugurates a new generation of multilateral programs to promote school meals reform in low and middle income countries, and now turning its attention to Europe to promote universality and uptake there. This is my penultimate slide, and it raises both hope and despair, really. It's hope because the public sector is finally getting its act together and organizing itself right across the public sector to promote good practice and to demand better conditions from government. Sadly, that when it's applied to join the Food and Drink Sector Council, DEFRA has rejected its application every time. And DEFRA has said the public sector is already represented. And it's represented by Robin Mills, the boss of Compass, which is part of the biggest food catering multinational in the world. It beggars belief that DEFRA could think that a private sector multinational company could be the authentic voice for prisons, for local authorities, and for hospital trusts. I've written to DEFRA to complain, and I've written a blog on the FFCC, the Food Farming and Countryside Commission, for those who want to see the details. But I'm hoping DEFRA will change its mind. And finally, I want to end with just raising three key issues that the food movement needs to address, the good food movement needs to address in all countries. How do we embed good food policies in public institutions so that when they begin, they get embedded rather than ending and petering out when the original team moves on? How do we move from behavioral change to organizational change? Secondly, how do we integrate public procurement with policies to support production and consumption? I make this argument in the book by saying politicians are slowly waking up to the potential of public procurement, but they still see it as a silver bullet, thinking of it as a silo, whereas procurement is being set up to fail unless it's integrated with policies to support production and consumption. And in the book, I give the example of horticulture. How can public bodies procure more fruit and vegetables, for example, if the horticultural sector is on its knees? And even if we produce more fruit and vegetables, what if the kids are not eating it in school? So we need to think of the school food system as an ecosystem in which procurement is integrated in and embedded in policies for production and consumption. And then when we see local innovation, how do we scale it up? How do we replicate it so it becomes the national norm, not the exception? And last but not least, how do we put the good food movement on a more secure financial footing? Because quite frankly, in the UK, it's a miracle that the good food movement has emerged in the first place in the form of the Sustainable Food Places Network. It's emerged at a time of austerity, which has denuded public bodies of budgets and capacity, and yet the good food movement has emerged. But it's living on a wing and a prayer, and we need to put it on a financial footing, and that can only be done by working in concert, I argue, with organizations like the National Health Service and with local government, so that public food provisioning becomes part of the norm and not the exception. Thanks very much, Christina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. What an excellent overview of your very comprehensive book, and a really lovely guide through the three public sectors where food is being marginalized in many ways that you describe. And it's so refreshing to hear about prisons and actually food in prisons. We have a huge number of questions that are coming through, so I encourage everyone listening to continue to add your questions. So now is an extra bonus where we get to discuss and hear from Kevin. I just wanted to pick up on two things really. One, in your summary slide, which is really, really helpful, thinking about embedding practices, and obviously policy is one of those key opportunities. And I was just thinking in terms of your key recommendations for the government food strategy that's under development, what are your top recommendations? What are your top asks that you think must be included?
Oh, blimey, Christina! There's so many things that need to be done. I mean, it would be a good start if they monitored and evaluated their existing regulations as lame and as weak as they are. There's so little compliance in the system that we can't read off from the standards what's going on in practice, because we know that so many public bodies are way off complying with the standards as they are. So getting new standards across the public sector would be a good start, and then ensuring that we've got credible monitoring and evaluation systems in place to ensure that compliance is treated far more seriously than it has been today. And the second thing I would say, at a general level, other than echo the excellent recommendations from Henry Dimbleby's report, I would say it would be good to think that food policy needs to adopt a food system approach, as many people on the call will have argued and will be aware of. And I give the example of procurement, that still we see politicians talking about it in a silo, saying it needs to source 50% of local food needs to be British, as if that ticks the box. Procurement can't do it on its own. It's too much work for procurement to carry. So procurement needs to be embedded in a food system approach, which gives parity of esteem to production policies as well as consumption policies, because procurement faces both ways, Christina, doesn't it? As we know. So that food system approach, I would say, would go a long way to help us all, and it would help us to have more confidence that standards that have been introduced are being complied with.
I couldn't agree more with those two top recommendations. I think enforcement and monitoring is so crucial. And I think one of the big areas that we really need to explore more is how to fund that. How can it be adequately funded? Because at the moment, the government haven't got the funding. So what are the mechanisms that we can use through monitoring and evaluation that actually bring in adequate funding? And love to revisit that with you. I also really agree with you on the food systems approach, obviously, and production, consumption, but also training. And I look forward to us talking about that next month, more about, training and particularly around professional cookery and chefs. Kevin, I'm going to move on to questions from others and stop stealing the chair's prerogative of asking the questions. So your dear colleague, Martin Karaha, has a couple of questions for you. The first one is around the breakfast scheme. So the school breakfast scheme, it's only in its pilot at the moment, and some of the pilot schools have already withdrawn due to budgeting and staffing issues. And just your reflections on this issue and again, what might be done around this. It's a great initiative by the government, but already starting to see failure.
Yeah. Well, Martin has hit the nail on the head with the breakfast schemes. I mean, speaking personally, I was always disappointed that the Labour government didn't treat breakfasts in a whole school approach with a new deal nationally for England on primary free school meals, because breakfast would complement a free school meal. Instead, by investing in breakfasts and doing nothing for free school meals, it's kind of set those two groups, the breakfast lobby, Magic Breakfast, so on and so forth, set it against the school food organizations, the school lunch organizations. So that's created some tensions in the school food movement, it seems to me. But ideally, I think we should go for the gold standard approach, which is breakfasts working in concert with school lunches, because as Martin has said, we're already seeing I forget what the term was from the government, the early adopter schools, however many, there were 450 or something like that, and some of them are peeling off now because they realize the economics don't stack up. It would be a new scheme which the schools themselves would be subsidizing out of the school budget. This is why it's so important to the school food reform movement, as you know, Christina, that we're fighting for more money in school meals, but also to have it ring fenced, because so much money is leaking out to other budgets, and we need to ring fence that money, because there's nothing more important than giving children a real good nutritional foundation, because without that, they don't learn. It's a simple point, but it's a point that bears reiterating. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to Martin's question, but breakfast won't do it on its own, sadly.
And it's so related. I mean, Martin also talked about the only 3p increase in school food meals that has just been announced by the government, and how inadequate that is, and links very much to the ring fencing that you're talking about, but also potentially linking to Ofsted and requirements around food in Ofsted. Is very, very important. And again, how do we call for more food? And more money towards school food. So Rebecca O'Connell says, thanks very much for a wonderful and inspiring presentation, Kevin. I love your book. A question that we're grappling with in a project aiming to improve food in Children's Hospital in the UK, which is a fast food nation, is this. Food is an important way in which child patients can exert a sense of control and experience a sense of comfort and normality when so much is out of their control in terms of treatment. But what's normal for children's food in the UK is often junk food. And as researchers, we can note this problem and contradiction, but we need some practical solutions. Do you have any thoughts about how hospitals and other institutions that provide food for children can address this issue here and now, rather than waiting for societal norms to change and catch up?
Well, I'm aware of the work that Rebecca's doing in terms of children's hospitals. I don't myself work in children's hospitals, but I'm aware of the challenges. And I think there's a common challenge, Christina, right across all different sites where children eat and served. And it's a challenge that I learned close hand in Malmö from the Swedes, where it was the first time I'd really seen a catering system treat children with a sense of agency, that children became co-designers of some of the menus, particularly in the transition to plant-rich menus. Initially, the menus had a pushback from parents who accused the city of feeding their children protein-free food because it was meat-free. So that the city realized they needed to engage more with both parents and with children. And now the children have tasting sessions on all novel menus so that they become, as I say, empowered agents rather than kind of victims of circumstance, you know. And going back to Rebecca's question, I think the more children can have a sense of agency to be co-producers of the food that they're asked to eat, the more success I believe we'll have with it. And the work, by the way, I should mention the work of Greta de Feita in Northumbria here, where Greta's work shows the value of co-production, where we treat children seriously and as agents of their own transformation rather than objects.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. The power of co-production is so important, isn't it? And even how some of the highly processed fast foods can actually be made healthy if they're made fresh.
Yeah.
and co-produced, and children are part of that. What a great response. Thank you. Andrea Zick has a question. She says, I wonder if you could explore the connection of these arguments to the right to food movement, which appear to have similarities to what you're promoting, but also create some tension between both movements.
The right food movement.
The right to food.
Oh, the right, sorry, the right to food. To be honest, Christina, I'm not aware of the tensions. I'm ashamed to say. What are those tensions?
I'm not sure either. Sorry, Andrea, you'll need to add that in a little bit further. Sorry, perhaps I didn't read that one so well. Let's keep going.
Very sorry about
Hopefully
that.
Andrea will add a little bit extra and we can come back to it. So Matthew Thompson says, thank you, Kevin, for highlighting the great work of Roy Health and team that we're doing in Cornwall 20 years ago. Does your book reference this specifically? There is actually some positive legacy from the initiative that happened, and it's ongoing now, but we do need to do more. Would you have any suggestions for us in building on those lapsed foundations?
Well, I do feature the Cornish experiment in the book as a high point of the early attempts to create local social innovation in the health service. And I was, I had a bit part in the sense that I was involved in the conversations around it when I was the chair of the Bristol Food Policy Council. One of our big conversations was to bring producers together to meet commissioners and procurement managers to have a direct face-to-face contact. And that was one of the most productive things I thought we ever did. And we brought the Cornish people to, it was in, I think it was a big conversation, hosted in Yo Valley's farm. And that was a sign to my mind of the power of relationships in the food system when people stop being anonymous boxes on a spreadsheet, as it were, and you began to meet people face to face to learn about each other's problems, and then trying to align each other's interests to create a sense of shared destiny in a localized or regionalized food system. Cornwall was a pioneer in all that, and I'd be delighted to hear from the Cornish partners if they're still doing that work, because I've lost touch with them, sadly.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think that it does break down so many power dynamics too, doesn't it? When you bring people together,
Mm.
it's the orchestrating of that that can often be the challenge.
Yeah.
We have a great question from Anna from Nourish Scotland about asking what your perspective is on public diners, state-supported restaurants serving affordable, healthy meals to all, and the calls to reintroduce them in the UK. What do you think about that, and how do you think that fits with your serving the public?
Well, it's a fabulous program. I followed it, this program, because I follow the work of Nourish Scotland, and I'm aware of the public diner work as well. And Pete Ritchie has kept me informed of some of this as well. No, I'm a great fan of it. I wonder how it would work now practically. We know how it worked during the war. Now there are so many other private and third sector restaurants. I suspect they would all complain to government if the public diner was in receipt of public subsidies, and they weren't, as it were. But I love the concept of the public diner, especially not least because it has a certain classless feel about it. You know, this is not just for the poorest of the poor, but anyone who wanted an unpretentious, nutritious meal which was affordable.
And wouldn't that be wonderful as an alternative to fast food outlets for young
Absolutely.
people? You know, who really do congregate in those areas, because in fast food outlets, because they feel comfortable, they've got free Wi-Fi, you know, to have
Yeah.
actually public diners that were attractive for young people would be
Yeah.
incredible. Anise de France asks, I notice that you use the concept ecological citizenship using London School as an example in some earlier work. Does this concept still feature in your new book? And is this a concept that you still find helpful?
Yes, I have a schema of different phases of the history of school food systems, and I argue that the whole school approach is part of an emerging ecological model of school food system. You know, work in progress, clearly, but it's about if we treat the whole school food system properly in a holistic way, as they're trying to do in Malmö, where they have a concept of the pedagogical meal, where they're trying to integrate catering with teaching, to use food as a prism for learning about the world, about nature, about biodiversity, climate change, as well as what it does for our bodies. You know, one of my sons is a teacher, and in a secondary school, and he says when he does special programs on classes using the example of ultra processed food and what it can do to our bodies and our minds, he says the kids are really engaged to find out what it's doing to them, you know, as if they've been duped. And they don't want to, kids don't like being duped like the rest of us. You know, they want a sense of agency. So good food can empower. And that's a very powerful message, it seems to me.
It is, and it's up against a very good comment here from Lukemi Atajosena. Excuse me if I've mispronounced your name. It says, how do we get the public sector to recognize that the commercial sector is not obliged to carry the moral conscience of the nation? Their role is to satisfy their shareholders, and therefore we need more robust monitoring to enforce the system of compliance. But just thinking, you talk a bit about sort of neoliberal policies, and how do we actually overcome that with many of the local authority caterings for schools closing in the way that you described? You know, it really does feel like the shift of power, the shift of wealth is continuing to go in the direction against the way that we all want it to go.
Yeah. Well, I think whatever the policy, Christina, I think it begins with something that we can't, in the food movement, we really can't escape, and that is, you know, to have a really uncompromising, compelling narrative about what it is about good food and why we need to view and value it in more robust ways. You know, that in terms of school food, for example, we it's an investment in the future health and well-being of citizens, not a welfare measure for the poorest of the poor. We've got to be uncompromising about that. It will cost a little bit more. The Food for Life scheme costs a bit more. But when you get the real costs and benefits worked out, when we've internalized costs that have been externalized in the fast food industry, arguments that we all know about, but politicians have been far too coy and timid, I would say pusillanimous, one of my favorite words, which I don't get a chance to use very much, which means spineless in the face of the food lobby, absolutely spineless. So we need more robust regulation because there is a yearning, I think, in society, as the big conversation of the FFCC conversation showed. People want action on this because they can't do it themselves in a food environment which is obesogenic. You don't have free will in an obesogenic environment. And I just think we need to be more robust and uncompromising about these messages to politicians and hold them to account.
I couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. A follow-up question is, what is your take on in-house catering as a model that makes children the shareholder and the owner of their catering service versus the pressures for, commercial catering companies and catering providers?
Yeah, well, I've tried to champion in-house catering in my book, but also to recognize that it can work well with social enterprises in a public social partnership. The concept that one of our mentors at Sussex University used to tell us, Robin Murray, who became a major social innovation thinker, where he recommended public social partnerships. So in-house catering is a model that I would champion, so long as it's providing quality food. I mean, ultimately, the test has got to be the quality of food on a child's plate, and we can't defend public catering if it's not delivering. I mean, I would add that caveat, but I don't believe, Christina, that we've woken up to the challenge of the disappearing local authority role in England, and that we need a call to arms to say we must defend new municipalism in the school food movement. Otherwise, it's going to go the way of adult social care.
Yeah, whether that can be really wrapped up in the mayoral responsibilities and the regionalism that is, being pushed by the current government and really incorporate that argument. I completely agree. We've had a response from Andrea Zick, which is very helpful. So this was the tension between, offering free food through public procurement versus the right to food. So what she says is, I would say that by offering access to free food through public procurement, we might undermine the argument for people's right to food, which could hamper the overall movement. On initial observation, free school meals appear to align, but if we feed children well in schools, the danger is that we're pitching population groups of need against each other.
Okay, well, Andrea, I'm sorry that I wasn't aware of this. I really wasn't aware of these tensions. But if it ends up compromising the demand for universal free school meals, I personally wouldn't be in favor of it, because I think that's probably one of the most radical demands any progressive can make in a society today, that children need access to healthy, appetizing, wholesome, sustainably produced food, because it's a sustainable development goal number two. Number one and number two are there for a good reason. They are the foundational goals for the other 15 goals. You can't achieve the other goals. So without a good nutritional foundation, it seems to me, and the only way to get that, in my estimation, particularly among poor households, is to try to have a universal free school meal system which takes stigma and shame out of the system and allows all kids to eat on a level playing field. There's something profoundly important from a citizenship point of view about universal free school meals. So for me, that's that's top of my ask list of any government, because that in turn leads to multiple dividends. Socially, economically, you can build more robust food chains, as we are trying to do in Wales now, linking universal free school meals with a radical new project called Welsh Veg in Schools, trying to rebuild links between procurement and horticulture, which is a powerful new movement in Wales. So that's my only thought really on procurement.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you very much. A lovely comprehensive answer. I just wanted to pick up on that because I think that, and it's a question here from Alex Cosmos around the Department of Education looking to rush through, so their local education department looking to rush through school meal provision in primary schools by bringing in large manufacturing suppliers. Peptio is who they've said. And it's similar to conversations I'm having with our sort of local schools where the local authority caterer has closed. And so similarly, they're looking to push through sort of big contracts very, very quickly. And some of the pushback that we come across is not having infrastructure, but also not having clear enough evidence to the link between the benefit that you might see in education outcomes or you might see in health outcomes. So there's sort of two questions there. One is about the requirement for investment up front and putting that investment in for infrastructure for fresh cooking or for in-house cooking. And the second one is, how do we do better in portraying the evidence? You mentioned it early on about the NHS audit. It's unable to assess the factors that are gained from improved nutrition in hospitals. And I think it's the same in schools and then potentially in prisons. So how do we deal with those? So two questions wrapped up in one there, Kevin.
Yeah, well, taking the second question first, Christina, I'm always amazed that people, especially politicians, can be amazed about the lack of evidence. There is a relative lack of evidence, but that's not a mystery. When you think how little public money has been invested from take research and development budgets. It's invisible, the amount of money that's been put into doing monitoring and evaluation systems of the effects, the multiple effects of public food. It's been done for Sweden, where they've found some very positive benefits. But I would say we have to take a tapered approach. The most important immediate benefit is the evidence from teachers. There's a behavioral dividend noticeable within weeks and months in terms of a balanced diet, and then over time we hope to see some attainment benefits. Long term, we expect, don't we, to see health benefits, but that's over the course of a lifetime. So I think we need to take these doubting Thomases on and say, put your money where your mouth is. If you want to see more evidence, start investing in it. That would be my response, and what I think the good food movement. This is how we should be responding to governments in the United Kingdom. The first part of the question was about investment in infrastructure. There are still beacons of good practice in local authorities in England. I'm currently in dialogue with Derek Wright and his team in Blackpool. Derek Wright has worked minor miracles in this space. He's shifted his school take-up from 11 schools contracting with the council to 32 schools. So Derek is doing something right. Why aren't we learning more about what's going on in Blackpool, and why aren't we disseminating those secrets, as it were, to the rest of the sector? Because it's clearly not a foregone conclusion that local authorities are going to go the way of the dodo.
That's definitely bucking the trend. I think that is where your pilots and diffusion of innovation is so important, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more about the evidence. I think you talked about schools, but it's the same about hospital stay, isn't it? Days in hospital stay and some of the very terrifying sort of outcomes, health outcomes that you're seeing in prisoners because of poor quality of diet. We've got a question here from Victoria Williams. She says, thanks for highlighting the issue of prison food. This is rarely addressed in the public procurement discussions. And in terms of public comms, winning hearts and minds, it's much easier to put forward a good case for children or for hospital patients, but much harder for prisoners, as you mentioned yourself in your talk. You talk about it in terms of fiscal savings and taxpayer pounds, but do you think it's possible with the continuing political agenda of being tough on crime, etc.? Do you really think that's a possible narrative? And what do you think is going to be the best approach to recognising food as central to rehabilitation rather than punishment?
Yeah. Well, Victoria, this is a great a question, and of course, I respect the work that Food Matters and Food Behind Bars, the work that Lucy Vincent's organization does. I mean, that's terrific work going on in terms of raising the quality of food in prisons. It seems to me, well, I try to argue in the book, we should treat it in terms of both an ethical duty of care as well as a fiscal duty of care. The ethical duty of care is obvious. These people are already being punished because they've lost their liberty. We're still investing in punishment. We're not investing in rehabilitation. And if we don't invest in rehabilitation, the vast bulk of prisoners will be released. 96% of them are men. The vast bulk will be released. They'll be in society, walking down our streets. If we don't treat them seriously, nutritionally and with dignity, then these people will become dangerous people in society. And therefore, food has a role, as a moral role to play in terms of rehabilitating people, it seems to me. And we have to remind politicians and readers of the Daily Mail that we're spending between 18 and 20 billion pound per annum in the UK on reoffending, that as soon as they're out, they're back in prison. And some of that money should be repurposed into programs like the Clink, programs that Food Matters is running, Food Behind Bars, to restore some dignity and hope and rehabilitation to prisoners. Food has a big role to play in that rehabilitation.
Absolutely. And the potential for training, as the great examples that you outlined, skill building, where actually then build and is a benefit to the economy.
Yeah.
Raymond Coker says, would many of the problems with the lack of nutrition not be overcome if nutrition was on the syllabus of primary and secondary schools?
Yeah. Yes.
I think we all agree with that, don't
absolutely.
we?
Absolutely.
Food education.
Food literacy in schools and nutrition being given parity of esteem in the healthcare services, because it's been a Cinderella versus the 3D model of healthcare, I argue, of drugs, diagnostics, and whatever the third D is, Christina.
Absolutely. Pete Ritchie has one of our last questions for you.
Oh.
Kevin, you'll remember Gordon Brown's Spend to Save program 20 years ago.
Yes.
Do you see any sign of that approach reappearing in relation to population health?
I don't see much of it happening, Pete. But yesterday, the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales said that the future of all public investment should be focusing on prevention, and that prevention budgets need to be ring-fenced, because spend to save is at the heart of prevention. And I think this is one of the untapped resources of the good food movement. We should be saying to the health service, you are trying to move from treatment to prevention, which is good, but you can't do it without the good food movement, because good food is right at the heart of that transition. So I'm with you every way, Pete.
Yeah. So two last questions that are kind of linked up, and I'll wrap them into one. One from Ruth Hegarty in Northern Ireland, and sorry, just double check that she was in Ireland, sorry. And then a second from Emily Owen, and they're both talking about the cost of food. So Ruth asks whether or not it's all not-for-profit initiatives that are actually able to provide healthy, sustainable foods in terms of public procurement. And then Amelie says, how can we persuade public services to overcome the higher costs of local and healthy produce?
Yeah. Well, I would suggest looking at the learnings from the Welsh Veg in Schools project, because these initial upfront costs were a barrier, and the Welsh government invested in a judicious way to make up the cost differential, to get the process moving. We've created a bandwagon. We're now going for scale, and the organisers of Welsh Veg for School, Katie Palmer and Ed Morgan, have done a marvelous job trying to overcome these initial hurdles about cost. There are ways of doing it, Christina, but we need to share good practice about how to overcome these initial barriers.
Absolutely, that's great. And what are the platforms for sharing that good practice and best practice more widely?
Your Centre is one of them.
Without a doubt.
The Soil Association, Sustain, the Food Foundation. These are all excellent platforms for looking at good practice, it seems to me. But the good food movement really needs to come together on foundational issues that we all share, quite apart from the single issues that have led to our that we are mainly focused on, it seems to me.
Oh. And if there's any reason to do it, it's the development of a new food strategy, isn't there, for us to really come together. Kevin, thank you so much for such an inspiring and insightful Food Thinkers. We've had an excellent discussion, and it's been hugely popular, as you can see from all the questions. So thank you very, very much. I encourage everyone to read Kevin's book. It's an excellent read with some really excellent examples in there, and then a real what we can do. So it ends on that real positive note in your final chapter. So Kevin, thank you very, very much. And everyone, as we said, we're taking a break for May. On the 15th of May, we've got our Centre for Food Policy Symposium. So we look forward to seeing all of you that have registered at that event. And then please do look out for registrations for the 24th of June for Stuart Gillespie. Thank you again, Kevin, so much. Bye-bye, everyone.